Dalton Keene figured he was playing for cattle. He sat at that worn-out poker table, the smoky air thick enough to chew, and saw a future where his ranch wasn't turning to dust. He saw breeding stock. He saw a lifeline. He held aces over kings, a hand so good it felt like destiny. He was about to win back his life. But he didn't win cattle. He didn't win land. He won a 17-year-old girl. The saloon went quiet. So quiet you could hear a man's heart pound. The old rancher, Joaquin Herrera, didn't push forward a stack of coins. He pushed forward a piece of paper, his hands shaking so bad the ink seemed to tremble. It was a deed, but not for property. It was for a person. Her name was Esperanza. And in that one gut-wrenching moment, everything Dalton thought he knew about winning and losing, about luck and despair, crumbled into nothing. The winning hand in his grip suddenly felt like a curse. "I got nothing left but this," Joaquin whispered, his voice cracking. "My niece. She work hard. She cook. She clean. She worth more than any cattle, senor." Dalton's throat felt like sandpaper. He was 45 years old, beaten down by 3 years of drought that had turned his land to a graveyard for his herd. His house was empty. His life was empty. He'd come here for a last-ditch chance to build something, anything that would outlive him. But this was a line he never imagined crossing. The other men at the table, grizzled ranchers and rough-looking traders, shifted in their seats. Their eyes darted from the paper to Dalton, to the saloon door, as if expecting the devil himself to walk in. "I don't want a girl," Dalton said, his voice a low growl. He tried to push the paper back. "Keep your family." But Joaquin's eyes were wild with terror. "Please, senor," he begged, tears carving paths through the grime on his face. "I owe money to very dangerous men. They come tomorrow. If I cannot pay them—" He didn't have to finish. Everyone in that room knew the kind of men he was talking about, the kind that don't accept apologies. Just then the saloon door creaked open, and she walked in. It had to be her. Esperanza. She wasn't what he expected. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, her dress was simple but clean, and she moved with a purpose that silenced the room all over again. She walked right past her trembling uncle and looked straight at Dalton. And her eyes, they held more fire than fear. It was the look of a wild horse deciding whether to bolt or to fight, a look that said she was no one's property. "Uncle," she said, her English crisp and clear, "you do not have to do this." Dalton stared at her, caught off guard. This wasn't some poor, helpless girl being sold off. This was someone who was walking into the fire with her eyes wide open. He looked at his winning hand, then back at her. The other players were getting restless. "Take the pot or fold, Keene," Murphy, the saloon owner, grumbled. "We ain't got all night." Dalton looked at the girl. She wasn't pleading with him. She was assessing him, sizing him up, trying to read his soul right there at the poker table. And he realized, with a jolt that ran colder than a winter creek, that this wasn't about winning a pot anymore. This was about what kind of man he was going to be when the chips were down. And then she spoke to him directly, her voice steady as a rock. "The men my uncle owes money to, senor. Are you worse than them?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. She'd turned the whole thing on its head. She wasn't the prize. She was the one asking the questions. "I reckon that's something you'd have to decide for yourself," Dalton managed to say. He felt the weight of every man's stare. He saw the greed, the pity, the disgust. He looked at the $300 debt that was about to destroy 2 lives. It was the exact amount he needed for his breeding stock. A fortune. He could walk away, leave them to their fate. Or he could take a gamble wilder than any hand of cards he'd ever played. He reached into his coat, his hand closing around the worn leather of his wallet. He pulled out the money he'd been saving for years, the cash that was supposed to be the seed of his new future. He counted out $300, bill by bill, and slid it across the table. Not to claim his winnings, but to buy them. "I'm not taking your niece," Dalton said, his voice ringing with a finality that shocked even himself. "But I'll pay your debt. She can come work for me, earn her keep, and when she's ready to move on, she's free to go." Joaquin collapsed into his chair, sobbing with relief. But Esperanza didn't cry. She walked to the table, picked up the deed that had her name on it, and tore it neatly in half. "I accept your offer, Senor Keene," she said. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Dalton felt a strange mix of dread and something else. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. But as he looked at the young woman standing beside him, a silhouette against the starry sky, he couldn't shake a terrifying thought. He hadn't just hired a ranch hand, he had just invited a mystery into his life, and he had a gut feeling that the secrets she was carrying were far more dangerous than a $300 debt. The real trouble, he suspected, was just beginning. The 2-hour ride to the ranch was quiet, eerily quiet. Esperanza rode behind him on his horse, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes scanning the dark, rugged landscape as if she was memorizing every rock and every shadow. She wasn't just observing, she was calculating. Dalton could feel it. When the silhouette of his ranch finally appeared against the pre-dawn sky, a familiar shame washed over him. Even in the darkness, the neglect was obvious. The sagging fences, the barn door hanging on by a single hinge, the silence where the lowing of a healthy herd should have been. "It's not much," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He expected pity, maybe even regret. Instead, she slid off the horse and studied the main house with a critical eye. "It has good bones," she replied, her voice neutral. "Sometimes that is enough to build on." Inside was worse. The moment Dalton lit the lamp, the truth of his life was laid bare. Dust was a thick blanket on every surface. Dishes from days past sat in the basin. It was the home of a man who had given up. "I'll sleep in the barn," Esperanza said, her gaze sweeping over the mess without a hint of judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. "No," Dalton said, more forcefully than he intended. "You'll take the spare room. It's got a bed." He led her to the small, cold room that he and his late wife, Martha, had once dreamed would be a nursery. It was the cleanest room in the house, only because he never went in it. The memory was too sharp. Esperanza set her small bag on the floor. "Senor Dalton," she said, turning to face him, her expression serious, "I am grateful for what you did, but I do not owe you anything beyond honest work. I have seen what happens when men think they are owed more." Her directness was like a splash of cold water. "I'm not that kind of man," he said, the words feeling clumsy and defensive. "I believe you," she said simply, "but I wanted it said clearly, so there are no misunderstandings." He just nodded, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Before he left her for the night, she asked, "What do you eat for breakfast?" "Beans, coffee, whatever's around." She wrinkled her nose slightly. "That is not a diet for a working man. I will cook." Dalton sat on his porch as the sun began to hint at its arrival. The quiet of his life shattered. Just hours ago, he was alone. Now a 17-year-old girl with the eyes of a hawk and the spine of a steel rod was sleeping in his house. A girl who negotiated her own freedom and then immediately started planning his life. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something immense. Her composure in the saloon wasn't just strength, it was a performance, a carefully crafted mask. And as the first birds began to sing, a chilling thought crept into his mind. Maybe she wasn't running from her uncle's debt at all. Maybe she was running from something so terrible that a poker game debt was the perfect cover story. He woke to a smell he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Fresh bread. He walked into the kitchen and found it transformed. The surfaces were clean. The dishes were washed and stacked. And Esperanza was at the stove, moving with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. A feast of eggs, bacon, and freshly baked bread was laid out on the table he hadn't seen the wood of in years. "Buenos dias," she said, not even turning around. "I found flour. You should buy more." "You didn't have to do all this," he mumbled, pouring a cup of coffee that tasted richer than any he'd ever made. "A ranch runs on work. Work runs on food," she said, turning to face him. She looked completely refreshed, as if she'd had a full night's sleep instead of a few troubled hours. "I have been thinking about your ranch." "What about it?" he asked, taking a bite of bread that was so good it almost made him angry. It was a taste of a life he thought he'd lost forever. "You are not using your land," she stated. "You have good water access from the creek, but you only raise cattle." Cattle die in a drought. You need diversity. Chickens for eggs. Goats for milk. They eat what cattle won't. A garden here, she pointed out the window, would provide food when money is scarce. Her analysis was brutally, shockingly accurate. She wasn't just talking about cooking and cleaning. She was talking business strategy. You learned all this raising goats with your family? He asked, trying to piece together her story. A shadow passed over her face just for a second, a flicker of something dark. Among other things, she said, quickly changing the subject. Your fences are weak, but the posts are solid. The barn foundation is strong. You have been doing just enough to keep from falling apart, but not enough to build. She sat down across from him, her gaze intense. I need to understand, why have you given up? The question stole the air from his lungs. I haven't given up. Haven't you? She challenged, her voice soft but sharp as a razor. You live like a man waiting for the ground to swallow him. You had plans, didn't you? With your wife? The mention of Martha was a knife twist. We were going to build a legacy, he said, his voice thick. Something to pass on to our children. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of children who were never born. So because there was no one to inherit it, you decided there was no point in building it? She pressed. What's the point? He shot back, the old anger rising in him. Esperanza was quiet for a long moment. My parents, she began, her voice changing, becoming distant. They taught me that building something good is worthwhile, even if you cannot keep it. The purpose of creating something beautiful is not to own it forever. It is to prove that beauty is possible in the world. The words struck him like a physical blow, but it wasn't just her wisdom that stunned him. It was the sudden, overwhelming certainty that this story about her parents wasn't the whole truth. Not even close. After breakfast, they walked the property. She wasn't just looking, she was studying, analyzing soil composition, wind direction, sun exposure. Her knowledge was staggering. It wasn't the knowledge of a simple goat herder's daughter. It was something more, something educated. Why do you care so much? He finally asked, stopping by the dry creek bed. Why waste your time on an old man's broken-down ranch? She turned to face him, the morning sun glinting in her dark eyes. Because I know what it feels like to lose everything, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, and to have to start over from nothing. Your parents' death, he said, remembering what little her uncle had told him. She took a deep, shaky breath, and he saw her wrestling with a decision. Then the mask cracked. My parents did not just die, Senior Dalton, she said, her eyes locking onto his. They were murdered. The world seemed to stop. The chirping of the birds, the rustle of the wind, it all went silent. Murdered. The word was an obscenity in the peaceful morning light. How? He breathed. For our land, she said, her voice gaining a hard, cold edge he'd never heard before. We had a small farm, but it had the best water rights in the valley. A wealthy rancher, a powerful man, wanted those rights for his own cattle. When my father refused to sell, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. They burned it all, the house, the barn, my parents. They made it look like an accident. He could see the fire reflected in her eyes, the memory still burning bright and terrible. You were there. I was in the next village. When I came home, there was nothing left. The authorities called it a tragedy. They didn't even investigate. The man who did it was too powerful. We were just poor farmers. Now he understood the fire in her eyes. It wasn't defiance, it was vengeance. My uncle, she continued, he tried to fight for justice. But we had no money, no influence. He started gambling, trying to win enough to hire real lawyers. He just lost what little we had left. He ended up in debt to those men. The pieces were slamming into place, forming a picture far more terrifying than he had imagined. This wasn't about a gambling debt. It was about a conspiracy, a murder. So your uncle, he wasn't just saving his own skin at that poker game, Dalton said, his mind reeling. He was trying to hide you. Yes, she said, from the men he owed money to, and from the man who killed my family. He's still looking for me. Dalton stared at her, this 17-year-old girl who had survived an inferno, who was being hunted by a killer, and who was now standing on his land, planting a vegetable garden as if her world wasn't about to collapse. But as he looked at her, another, even more disturbing thought took root in his mind. She was smart, too knowledgeable. Something was still missing from her story. Suddenly, she walked over to a pile of dusty boxes on his porch, things he hadn't touched since Martha died. She opened one, then another. It was Martha's old collection of journals. Esperanza flipped through a worn, leather-bound book, her fingers tracing the elegant script. "What are you doing?" he asked. She stopped on a page, her eyes widening slightly. "Your wife," she said, her voice hushed with discovery. "She writes here about the drought 10 years ago, how the main creek ran dry, just like now. But she says your father showed her something, a secret, a place on this land he called with a hidden spring." Dalton froze. He'd never heard of any hidden spring. His father had never mentioned it. "She wrote that it never runs dry?" Esperanza continued, her voice filled with a strange urgency. "That it was the family's failsafe. Dalton, if this is real, it could save this ranch." A surge of impossible hope shot through him. A hidden spring. It felt like a miracle, a message from the past, from his wife. But as they stood there, the forgotten journal open in Esperanza's hands, a sound broke the morning stillness. The distinct sound of horses approaching. Not one, several. They looked at each other, the same thought flashing in their eyes. The men her uncle owed money to? Or the man who murdered her parents? Then they saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun, coming up the path to the house. They weren't moving like friendly neighbors. They were moving like predators. Esperanza's face went pale, but her eyes were like flint. "They found me," she whispered. And Dalton knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the game he'd started at that poker table was about to turn deadly. He hadn't just bought a girl's debt. He had bought into her war. And the first battle was about to begin right on his front porch. The 3 riders fanned out as they approached the house, their movements practiced and menacing. They weren't grubby debt collectors. They were hard men, their faces like stone, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips. Dalton felt the familiar weight of the shotgun he kept just inside the door, his mind racing. "That's far enough," Dalton called out, his voice steadier than he felt. He stepped in front of Esperanza, shielding her. The man in the center, a brute with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes, smirked. "We're not here for you, old man. We're here for what Herrera owes our boss. He said we could find his payment here." His eyes slid past Dalton, locking onto Esperanza with a predatory gleam. Looks like he was telling the truth. "Her uncle's debt is paid," Dalton said, his hand inching toward the doorway. "I cleared it. You have no business here." The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Our boss has a different understanding of the terms. A verbal agreement ain't worth the spit it's written on. We'll be taking the girl as collateral until we see cash." "That's not going to happen," Dalton said, his voice dropping to a low growl. The air grew thick with tension. The riders' hands moved from resting on their guns to gripping them. Dalton knew he was outmatched. He might take one of them down, but not all 3. He braced himself for the explosion of violence he knew was coming. Then, Esperanza stepped out from behind him. "You are trespassing on private property," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. The men looked at her, surprised by her audacity. "And according to territorial law," she continued, her tone becoming formal, almost academic, "the verbal contract you claim was superseded by a documented financial transaction, a record of which is held by the saloon owner, Mr. Murphy. Your continued presence constitutes harassment and intent to commit kidnapping, which carries a federal sentence." Silence. The 3 riders stared at her, their tough guy smirks completely gone, replaced by looks of utter confusion. This wasn't the reaction they expected from a terrified teenage girl. She was quoting law at them. The scar-faced leader narrowed his eyes. "What did you say?" "I said," Esperanza repeated, taking another step forward, her chin high, "that you are breaking several laws. And if you do not mount your horses and leave this property immediately, Senor Keene and I will be prepared to defend ourselves under the castle doctrine, and then we will ride to the sheriff and file formal charges. Do you understand the words I'm saying?" It was the most bizarre standoff Dalton had ever witnessed. She wasn't threatening them with a gun. She was threatening them with a law book. And it was working. They were completely thrown off balance. They had come for a simple snatch and grab, not a legal debate with a 17-year-old. The leader stared at her for a long, hard moment, then at Dalton, then back at her. He seemed to be re-evaluating the entire situation. Finally, with a curse under his breath, he spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled. He jerked his head at his men, and without another word, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in their wake. Dalton stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, the unused shotgun feeling heavy in his hands. He turned and looked at Esperanza. She was trembling slightly, the adrenaline finally hitting her, but her eyes were blazing with triumph. "Where," Dalton asked, his voice barely a whisper, "did a goat herder's daughter from a small Mexican village learn about territorial law and the castle doctrine?" The mask was gone. The mystery he had sensed from the very beginning was standing right in front of him, and he knew he wasn't going to get a simple answer. Esperanza took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over his dusty, failing ranch. "My father was not just a farmer, Senor Dalton," she said, her voice heavy with secrets. "He was a cartographer, a map maker, and he had been hired by a group of small landowners to survey the entire valley." Dalton felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "The wealthy rancher who wanted our land, a man named Silas Croft, wasn't just after our water," she continued, the story pouring out of her now. "He was after my father's work. My father discovered that for years Croft had been illegally diverting water from a shared aquifer, slowly strangling all the smaller ranches around him. He was stealing their futures, drop by drop." The pieces began to click into place. It was a story as old as the land itself. Greed, power, water. "My father's maps were the proof," she said, her voice thick with a daughter's pride. "Detailed, undeniable proof of Croft's crimes. The fire. It wasn't just to kill my parents and take our land. It was to destroy the evidence, to burn the maps." Dalton stared at her, the scale of the conspiracy hitting him with the force of a physical blow. This went so much deeper than a simple land grab. "But they failed," Esperanza whispered, in a fierce, dangerous light ignited in her eyes. "My father was clever. He had made duplicates. Before he died, he gave them to me." She looked at him, and he saw the full, terrifying truth of her situation. She wasn't just a witness. She was the evidence. The one thing Silas Croft feared more than anything else in the world. "My uncle's debt," she said. "It wasn't from gambling to hire lawyers. It was from paying coyotes to smuggle me and my father's maps across the border, to get us somewhere safe where Croft couldn't find us." Dalton's mind was reeling. The poker game, the deed, the debt collectors. It was all a lie. A desperate, brilliant piece of theater designed to hide a girl carrying a secret that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Where are they?" Dalton breathed. "The maps. Where are they now?" Esperanza looked down at her simple, dusty dress. With a steady hand, she reached for the hem. "Croft's men searched my uncle's wagon. They searched our belongings. They searched everywhere they could think of." She pulled at a loose thread, and a hidden seam began to open. "But they never thought to look here," she said, as she revealed a packet of oilskin-wrapped papers, sewn meticulously into the lining of her skirt. Dalton stared at the hidden maps, the proof of a crime that had cost two people their lives. He had thought he was helping a girl in trouble. He now realized he was standing at the epicenter of a war and holding the one weapon that could win it. Just as the reality of their situation began to sink in, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one was alone, and he was wearing a sheriff's star. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a man Dalton had known for 15 years, a man he'd considered, if not a friend, then at least an honest lawman. But as Bradley reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced calm, Dalton felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. "Morning, Dalton," Bradley said, his gaze lingering on Esperanza for a moment too long. "Heard you had some visitors. Caused a bit of a stir riding out of town so fast." "Just some men who got lost," Dalton said, keeping his voice even. "We pointed them in the right direction. Bradley didn't smile. Funny. The boys in town said they were asking about Joaquin Herrera, said he owed their boss a pile of money, said he'd left his niece's payment. He looked directly at Esperanza now. You must be the niece. My uncle's business is his own, Esperanza said, her voice polite but firm. The sheriff dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. Dalton, I'm going to be straight with you. I got a telegraph this morning from the federal marshals down in Texas. Esperanza's sharp intake of breath was the only sound. They're looking for a witness, Bradley continued, his eyes fixed on her. A young woman who survived a fire a few years back. A fire that killed her parents. A surveyor named Alonzo Reyes. The name hung in the air, confirming everything. The law was finally catching up to Silas Croft. They've finally got enough evidence to bring charges against Croft for murder and fraud, the sheriff said. But their case hinges on this witness. They need her testimony. Dalton felt a surge of relief. Justice. It was finally within reach. So they're coming to protect her? To take her back to testify? That's the plan, Bradley said. But his tone was flat, devoid of any relief. Problem is, Dalton, you're not the only one who knows she's here. I got that telegraph because Croft has connections everywhere. He knows the marshals are coming for her, and he's not going to let her reach that courthouse. The sheriff took a step closer, lowering his voice. He's put a bounty on her head. A big one. $5,000. Dead or alive. No questions asked. $5,000. It was an astronomical sum. Enough to make an honest man turn crooked and a crooked man turn into a monster. Every bounty hunter, every desperate gunslinger from here to the border would be coming for her. The federal marshals are trying to get to her first, Bradley said. But it's a race, and this is rough country. He paused, his eyes flicking from Esperanza's face to the dress she wore. They said the girl might be carrying something, some kind of proof. Documents her father left her. You know anything about that, son? The question was too casual, too pointed. Dalton saw it then, the subtle greed in the sheriff's eyes. Bradley wasn't just delivering a warning. He was fishing. He wanted to know if the rumors about the maps were true. He wanted to know what kind of leverage the girl was holding. All she has are the clothes on her back, Dalton lied, his heart pounding. She's just a scared kid. Bradley stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Well, you keep her safe, Dalton. The marshals should be here in a day or two. Just be careful who you trust. With a final nod, the sheriff mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence behind him. They were caught in a vice. Federal marshals on one side, a legion of bounty hunters on the other, and now a sheriff who seemed to be playing a game of his own. We have to find that spring, Esperanza said, her voice tight with urgency. We can't defend this place if we don't have water. We need to be able to hold out until the marshals get here. She was right. Their survival depended on it. Following the faded ink in Martha's journal, they searched the rocky, arid part of the ranch Dalton had always considered useless. The journal spoke of a cluster of 3 ancient oak trees and a rock shaped like a sleeping wolf. For hours they found nothing. The hope that had bloomed in him began to wither, and then they saw it. Tucked away in a small, hidden canyon, almost completely overgrown, were 3 massive oaks. And at their base, a large, weathered boulder that looked uncannily like a wolf at rest. With a shared sense of breathless anticipation, they pushed through the thick brush. And there it was. Not a gushing fountain, but a steady, clear trickle of water emerging from a fissure in the rock, pooling in a small stone-lined basin, before disappearing back underground. It was real, a secret, life-giving artery hidden within his dying land. It felt like a miracle, a gift from his past. As Esperanza knelt to cup the cool, clear water in her hands, Dalton noticed something else. A section of the rock wall behind the spring looked different. The stones were fitted together too perfectly, not like a natural formation. Driven by a sudden instinct, he pushed against it. With a low groan of grinding stone, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a dark, cavernous space behind it. It was a small, man-made cave. And inside, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs, sat a small, rotting wooden chest bound in iron straps. His father's secret. With trembling hands, Dalton lifted the chest and carried it out into the light. The lock was rusted through. He broke it easily with a rock. He lifted the heavy lid, his heart pounding, expecting he didn't know what. Gold, a family fortune. But it wasn't gold, it was paper. Old, yellowed letters and legal documents, tied in bundles with faded ribbon. It was his family's history. He unrolled the top scroll, and the words leaped out at him. A deed of partnership, dated 50 years ago, signed by his father, Elias Keene, and another man, a man named Alistair Croft, Silas Croft's father. He read on, his breath catching in his throat. The letters told a story he'd never known. His father and Alistair Croft had been partners, buying up a huge swath of the valley when it was still wild. They were supposed to build an empire together, but Croft, the wealthier and more ruthless of the two, had cheated him, used legal tricks, and forged documents to push his father out, leaving him with only this one difficult piece of land while the Crofts took the rest, the rich, well-watered heart of the valley. Dalton's entire life, his struggle, the drought, the poverty, it wasn't bad luck. It was the result of a generational crime, a 50-year-old betrayal. His fight against Silas Croft was no longer just for Esperanza. It was for his own father. It was personal. He dug deeper into the chest, his hands shaking with anger and a sense of profound, belated grief. At the very bottom, tucked inside a leather pouch, was one last, sealed letter. It was from his father, addressed to him. "My son," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have failed to reclaim what is ours, and the Croft betrayal stands. I was not strong enough or clever enough to fight them, but I did not leave you defenseless. I created a failsafe, a legal document, an ironclad title that proves their fraud and restores our family's rightful claim. I have hidden it where no one, not even a Croft, would ever think to look. The location is in the riddle I taught you as a boy, where the sun sleeps and the eagle guards. Forgive me for leaving you this fight. Avenge our name, the riddle." He remembered it, a silly rhyme his father had made him memorize. He'd thought it was just a game, but it was a map to his family's justice. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind them. Dalton spun around, his hand flying to his pistol. A man stood at the mouth of the canyon, blocking their only exit. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty black, and he moved with the silent grace of a predator. On his belt, next to a gleaming pistol, hung a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was the sign of Silas Croft's most feared bounty hunter, a man they called El Silbador, the Whistler, a man who was said to whistle a mournful tune just before he killed his prey. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "Found something interesting, did we?" he said, his voice soft. "The boss is going to be very pleased. The girl, the maps, and whatever little secrets you've dug up." He took a step forward, and a low, haunting whistle echoed through the small canyon, the sound of death. Dalton raised his pistol, Esperanza scrambling behind him. They were trapped. The spring that was meant to be their salvation had just become their tomb. El Silbador, the whistler, didn't rush. He savored the moment, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Give me the girl in the box, old man," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Do that, and I might just let you live out your miserable days on this pile of rocks." Dalton's mind was a whirlwind. The canyon was a death trap, a bottleneck with no escape. The bounty hunter was younger, faster. A direct confrontation was suicide. He needed a distraction, an advantage, anything. "The girl has nothing to do with this," Dalton said, playing for time, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Oh, she has everything to do with this," the whistler corrected, taking another slow step forward. "She's the loose end that's been bothering my boss for 3 years. He's a tidy man, Mr. Croft. He likes his accounts settled." As he spoke, Esperanza, hidden behind Dalton, was moving. Not in panic, but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, were scanning the rock face around the spring, the very same wall they had just been examining. She saw the network of cracks and fissures, the way the steady trickle of water had eroded the stone over centuries. She saw a weakness. You're a long way from home, bounty hunter. Dalton stalled, trying to keep the man's attention focused on him. The money's good wherever you find it, the Whistler shrugged, raising his pistol. The lazy confidence in his posture gone, replaced by lethal intent. Now I'm done talking. Just as he leveled his gun, Esperanza screamed, "Now!" She shoved a long, sturdy branch she'd picked up into a deep fissure in the rock wall right above the spring. With all her weight, she leaned on it, using it as a lever. At the same time, Dalton, understanding her desperate gamble in an instant, fired his pistol. Not at the bounty hunter, but at the rock face just beside him. The gunshot, the lever, and the natural weakness of the water-worn stone all converged in one explosive moment. With a deep, grinding roar, a huge section of the canyon wall fractured and collapsed. An avalanche of rock and earth thundered down, not on top of them, but directly into the narrow path where the bounty hunter stood. El Silbador, his eyes wide with shock, fired a wild shot that whizzed past Dalton's ear before he was forced to leap backward to avoid being crushed. The landslide didn't bury him, but it did something just as effective. It completely blocked the entrance to the canyon, sealing them in and him out. For a moment, there was only the sound of settling rock and their own ragged breathing. They were alive, trapped, but alive. A furious stream of curses erupted from the other side of the rockfall. "You can't stay in there forever," the Whistler roared. I'll wait. I'll wait until you starve." They were safe for now, but he was right. They had water, but no food. They had traded a quick death for a slow one. "He'll have to go for supplies eventually," Dalton said, trying to sound confident. "Or Croft will send more men. We just bought ourselves time." Esperanza wasn't listening. She was looking at the back of the small cave where they'd found the chest. "When the wall collapsed," she said, her voice hushed, "I felt a draft." They lit a spare lantern. At the very back of the small alcove, hidden behind a loose flap of rock, was another opening. A tunnel. Narrow and dark, leading deep into the earth. It was a secondary escape route, a bolt hole his father must have built. Hope surged through Dalton again. "My father, that clever old—" He choked on the words, a wave of pride and sorrow washing over him. The tunnel was cramped and claustrophobic, but it sloped steadily upward. After what felt like an eternity of scrabbling through the darkness, they saw a faint glimmer of light. They emerged, covered in dirt and grime, into a small, rocky outcrop several hundred yards away from the spring, completely hidden from view. They were free, but the bounty hunter was still out there, a man who now had a personal score to settle. "He thinks we're trapped," Esperanza whispered, her mind already working. "That's our advantage. He'll be watching the rock fall. He won't be expecting an attack from behind." "Attack?" Dalton said. "Girl, he's a professional killer. We just need to get away." "And let him go warn Croft that we have your father's chest? That we know about the spring?" she countered, her eyes flashing. "We can't just run. We have to finish this. We have to capture him." It was a crazy idea, a suicidal idea. But as he looked at the determination etched on her face, he knew she was right. They couldn't run forever. They circled back, moving like ghosts through the rocky terrain Dalton knew like the back of his hand. They found the Whistler's horse tied up, and his camp set up a short distance from the blocked canyon entrance. He was settling in for a long wait, just as they'd predicted. They laid their trap. A simple tripwire made from fence wire, placed on the path between his camp and the rock slide. A distraction. As night fell, Dalton threw a rock to the far side of the camp. The Whistler, startled, spun around, drawing his gun. At the same moment, Esperanza, hidden in the brush, let out a sharp whistle, mimicking his own haunting call. Confused and unnerved, the bounty hunter took a step toward the sound, right into their trap. The tripwire caught his ankle, and he went down hard. Dalton was on him in an instant, knocking the gun from his hand. The Whistler was strong, fighting back with a feral intensity. But Dalton had the element of surprise. After a brief, brutal struggle, he managed to knock the man unconscious with the butt of his pistol. They dragged him back to the barn, tying him securely to a support beam. As the bounty hunter slowly regained consciousness, his face was a mask of disbelief and pure fury. "You got lucky," he spat, testing his bonds. "Maybe," Dalton said, standing over him. Now you're going to tell us everything. How many more men is Croft sending? Where are they coming from? The Whistler just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. I'm not telling you anything. Croft pays me well because I don't talk. Dalton looked at Esperanza, a sense of defeat creeping in. They had the man, but they couldn't make him talk. But Esperanza's expression wasn't defeated. It was cold, calculating. She walked over to the bounty hunter's saddlebags, which they had brought back with them. She rummaged through them and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger. She flipped through the pages. You keep detailed records, she observed. Payments received, bounties collected, expenses. Her eyes scanned a recent entry. This is interesting. A payment made 3 days ago to a man named Joaquin Herrera. The name hit Dalton like a physical blow. The Whistler's confident smirk finally vanished. $1,000, Esperanza read, her voice dripping with ice. For information leading to the location of the target. She looked up from the book, her eyes boring into the captured bounty hunters. You didn't find us by tracking us from town, she said, the horrifying realization dawning on her. You were told where we were. She then turned her gaze on Dalton, and in her eyes he saw a pain so profound it stole his breath. The man who had raised her, the only family she had left. My uncle, she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time since he'd met her. He didn't just get into debt to save me. The bounty hunter, seeing his leverage gone, decided to twist the knife. The old man was terrified, he sneered. Croft's men found him, offered him a deal, his life and enough money to disappear forever in exchange for you. He sang like a canary. He sold you out, girl, your own flesh and blood. The betrayal was absolute, a blow more devastating than any bullet. Joaquin hadn't just been weak. He had actively betrayed her. He had led the wolf right to her door. Esperanza stumbled back, her face ashen. The foundation of her entire world had just been shattered. Everything she had endured, every risk she had taken, had been built on the belief that she was protecting her uncle as much as he was protecting her. And it had all been a lie. The poker game hadn't been a desperate gamble to save her. It had been the final act of his betrayal. He had delivered her right into the hands of a good man, hoping Dalton would be the one to take the fall when the bounty hunters arrived. The silence in the barn was heavy, broken only by the bounty hunter's ragged breathing. Esperanza stood frozen, the ledger clutched in her hand, the truth of her uncle's betrayal settling over her like a shroud. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, shattered look that terrified Dalton more than any of Croft's men. I have to find him, she said, her voice a dead, emotionless monotone. I have to ask him why. Esperanza, no, Dalton said, stepping toward her. It's too dangerous. Croft's men could still be out there. And what good will it do? The man made his choice. I have to know, she insisted, her gaze distant. I have to look him in the eye and hear it from him. Dalton saw that there was no arguing with her. This was a wound that went deeper than vengeance, deeper than fear. It was a wound to her soul. All right, he said, his mind already formulating a desperate plan. All right, we'll find him, but we'll do it my way. He turned to the captured bounty hunter. Your boss, Croft, he must have a way of communicating with you, a place you're supposed to check in. The Whistler, seeing a chance to sow more chaos, grinned. There's a dead drop, an old hollow log by the crossroads south of town. I was supposed to leave a message tonight confirming I had the girl. And if you don't, he'll send more men. A lot more. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would use the bounty hunter's information to lure Joaquin into a trap. Dalton would go to the dead drop and leave a new message, a fake one, supposedly from the Whistler. It would say that he had the girl, but she had mentioned her uncle was carrying a second, more valuable set of maps, and that Joaquin was planning to double-cross Croft and sell them to the highest bidder. It would paint Joaquin as a threat that Croft needed to deal with personally. Greed and paranoia, Esperanza said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old cold logic. Croft won't be able to resist. He'll send someone to grab my uncle immediately, and he'll tell them where to bring him. It was a long shot, a gamble that relied on the very worst of human nature. They left Esperanza in the house, the doors barred, with a rifle and instructions to shoot anything that came near. Dalton, with the Whistler's ledger as proof of his identity, rode to the crossroads. He found the hollow log and left the carefully crafted note inside, his heart pounding with every rustle of the leaves. The wait was agonizing. For 2 days they were prisoners on the ranch, starting at every shadow, every sound. They ate in silence, the chasm of Joaquin's betrayal between them. Dalton watched Esperanza, saw her retreating into herself, the vibrant, strategic mind that had so impressed him, now clouded by grief. On the third morning, a lone rider approached. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't a bounty hunter. It was a local boy from a neighboring farm. He carried a message. "A man in town, a Mexican fella, asked me to bring this to the Keene Ranch," the boy said, handing Dalton a folded, grimy piece of paper. "Paid me a whole $1 to do it." Dalton's hands trembled as he unfolded it. The writing was shaky, panicked. "They have me. They know everything. They are taking me to the old abandoned silver mine. Midnight. They say Croft is coming. Mija, forgive me." It had worked. Croft had taken the bait, and now he was bringing Joaquin to the one place where he could deal with a traitor without any witnesses. "The abandoned mine," Dalton breathed. "It's a maze of tunnels up in the hills. A perfect place for an execution." Esperanza took the note, her expression hardening, the grief being replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. "He's not just going to kill my uncle," she said. "He wants the maps. He thinks my uncle has them. He'll torture him first." A new, terrible urgency gripped them. They had to get to that mine, not just for justice anymore, but for a strange, complicated mercy. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, they rode toward the hills, leaving the captured bounty hunter tied securely in the barn. As they got closer, they dismounted, tethering their horses and moving forward on foot. The entrance to the mine was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the mountain. 2 of Croft's men stood guard outside, their silhouettes stark against the starlight. "We'll never get past them," Dalton whispered. "We don't have to," Esperanza replied, her eyes scanning the rock face above the entrance. "Remember what my father taught me? Always look at the lay of the land." She pointed to a narrow, almost invisible path that snaked up the side of the mountain. "Old ventilation shafts. The miners use them for air. Most of them are caved in, but there might be one that leads into the main tunnels." It was another incredible risk, but it was their only chance. They scrambled up the treacherous path, loose rocks skittering under their boots. They found a small, barred opening, a forgotten air shaft. The bars were old and rusted. Using a rock, Dalton managed to break them loose. They lowered themselves into the suffocating darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and forgotten time. They lit their lantern, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows. They were in a narrow side tunnel. In the distance, they could hear the faint echo of voices. They moved toward the sound, their hearts in their throats. The voices grew louder, bouncing off the tunnel walls. They reached an opening that looked down into a large central chamber. And they saw him, Silas Croft. He was just as Esperanza had described him, wealthy, powerful, with an aura of absolute authority. Joaquin was there, tied to a chair, his face bruised and swollen. "I'm telling you, I don't have them," Joaquin was pleading, his voice hoarse with pain. "She never told me where she hid them. I swear." "You are a liability, Joaquin," Croft said, his voice calm and chilling. "You were useful for a time, but now you are just another loose end." He nodded to one of his men. "Finish it." The man drew his pistol and cocked the hammer, the sound echoing like a death knell in the silent mine. Dalton raised his rifle, preparing to fire, knowing it would be a suicidal move. But before he could pull the trigger, Esperanza put a hand on his arm. She pointed to the ceiling of the chamber, directly above Croft and his men. A massive, ancient wooden support beam, strained and cracking under the weight of tons of rock, was held in place by a single, rusted iron winch. Her eyes met his, and he understood her insane, brilliant plan. It was the canyon all over again, but this time, the stakes were infinitely higher. She held up 3 fingers. She would count down. On 1, he was to fire. Not at Croft, at the winch. She began to lower her fingers. 3, 2. Dalton took a deep breath, the fate of everyone in that chamber resting on his aim. 1. He fired. The bullet screamed through the cavern, striking the rusted winch mechanism. With a piercing shriek of tortured metal, the winch shattered. The massive support beam groaned, splintered, and then gave way. The entire ceiling of the chamber collapsed. A deafening roar filled the mine as tons of rock and earth cascaded down, burying Silas Croft and his men in an instant tomb of their own making. A thick cloud of dust billowed up, choking the air. Dalton and Esperanza scrambled back, away from the dust in the horrifying finality of what they had just done. In the chaos, they could hear a single, terrified cry. Joaquin. The rockfall had missed him, but he was trapped, his chair pinned by a fallen beam. They rushed down into the ruined chamber. Joaquin stared at them, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. Esperanza walked toward him, her face unreadable. He flinched as she approached, expecting a blow, a curse. Instead, she knelt and, with a small knife, began to cut the ropes that bound him. "Why?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "After what I did, why would you save me?" Esperanza stood up, looking down at the broken man who had been her family, her protector, and her betrayer. "My parents taught me to be better than the men who hurt us," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "You will not die in this hole. You will live, and you will spend the rest of your life making amends for what you've done." She turned and walked away, not looking back. Dalton helped the sobbing, broken Joaquin to his feet, and together the three of them stumbled out of the darkness of the mine and into the clean, cold light of the dawn. The war was over, but the scars, Dalton knew, would last a lifetime. The aftermath was a whirlwind. When they returned to the ranch with a captive bounty hunter and a story that sounded like a fever dream, Sheriff Bradley had no choice but to act. Faced with the Whistler's confession, Joaquin's testimony, and the undeniable evidence in Dalton's father's chest, the law finally came down on the Croft Empire like a hammer. Federal marshals swarmed the valley. The mine was excavated, revealing the bodies of Croft and his men, confirming Dalton and Esperanza's story of self-defense. The legal documents from the chest were a bombshell. The riddle his father had left him, where the sun sleeps in the Eagle Guards, pointed to the town's bank, in a safe deposit box under the name Weston Eagle, a play on words Dalton had never understood until now. Inside was the ironclad document that changed everything. It wasn't just a claim to Dalton's ancestral land. It was a master partnership agreement. Dalton's father, foreseeing Croft's betrayal, had structured it so that any fraudulent transfer of assets would render the entire partnership void, with all holdings reverting to the wrong party. And, in a stroke of genius, he had hired a young, brilliant surveyor to validate the claim and add a legally binding addendum protecting the water rights of all surrounding properties. That surveyor was Alonzo Reyes, Esperanza's father. The document tied all three families together. In one fell swoop, the entire Croft Empire, the land, the cattle, the water rights, was legally transferred to Dalton Keene, and Esperanza's family land, along with the water rights her father had died to protect, was restored to her. Joaquin, full of remorse, testified against Croft's entire criminal network, helping to dismantle it piece by piece. In exchange for his cooperation, he was given a lenient sentence, and upon his release dedicated his life to a quiet, anonymous existence, helping other families who had been wronged by powerful men. Weeks turned into months. The ranch, now infused with capital and secured by the life-giving water from the hidden spring, began to thrive. Dalton hired on hands, bought new stock, and rebuilt the fences. The house, once a monument to a man's grief, became a home again, filled with the sounds of work and plans for the future. One evening, Dalton and Esperanza stood on the front porch, looking out over the land that was now green and teeming with life. She was no longer a girl of 17, but a young woman of 18, a landowner in her own right, her future her own to decide. "You know," Dalton said, his voice quiet, "I spent so many years thinking I had nothing to build for. No legacy to leave behind." Esperanza looked at him, a small, knowing smile on her face. "You were wrong. You just had to clear away the rocks to find the spring. He knew she wasn't just talking about water. He hadn't won a poker game that night. He had been dealt a new hand, a new life. He hadn't rescued a girl in trouble. A girl in trouble had rescued him. They weren't family by blood, but they had forged a bond in fire and betrayal, a partnership built on a foundation stronger than any rock. He had started out trying to save his ranch, but in the end, they had saved each other. And together they had built something beautiful, something that would last. If you were on the edge of your seat with Dalton in Esperanza's story, then you're going to want to see what happens when a lone lawman has to face down an entire outlaw gang in our next video. Click the video on your screen right now to watch another tale of justice and courage in the Old West. And hey, if you enjoy these stories, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you a thing, but it helps us keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.